Okay, time is up, so everyone can unmute themselves and come into the room for a moment. Okay.
Yeah, we could just see your dark, mysterious face, like we don't see any because there's no light.
I mean, honestly, I kind of prefer people not see my face. That's fine, but yeah, I'm probably going to move to my table anyway in a sec. But I like speaking.
Well.
So speaking orders, or?
Okay, so opening government, Din speaking first. Here, there, please.
Avery speaking second. Sheer day, please.
Opening opposition.
Hi, Jack speaking first. I prefer here, they, please.
Okay. Closing government.
Camille is speaking first. He or they, please, and then any she or they, please.
And closing opposition.
Mayor's first, Samuel second. Here, they is fine.
Okay, in that case, could everyone please remute themselves? You remain muted throughout the debate unless you have been accepted for POI or you are the speaker currently up. Are there any questions before we get started? No. Amazing. In that case, I would like to welcome the Prime Minister to open the debate here.
Can everyone hear me? Okay. What we're going to tell you in opening government is essentially not just how the incentives of dictators change, but also how this increases the strength, or at least the perceived strength, of the opposition, which acts as a control mechanism towards oppressive governments. But before that, a couple of points of framework. We do believe that a lot of opposition is going to be about how this is going to lead to more conflict and more death in the long run due to ripple effects and stuff like this. Couple of answers to this preemptively. First of all, we say that given that this is obviously a guild which seems to be more efficient and not being caught than the fucking Mossad or the CIA, means that they seem to have a lot of inside knowledge of the causal relationships between a country, how the army and its police work, what are the connections in the government and stuff like this. Which means that they will probably have a significant amount of knowledge and expertise to at least be relatively efficient in predicting whether their intervention or assassination is going to cause something like a massive civil war, and probably refrain if they believe that they will protect the weak less by doing so or endanger more of the weak, given that that is their creed. And the second thing which we would like to posit is that in a lot of these countries, also, can someone time me because I forgot to put on my timer? Just tell me when it's 6 minutes. Okay. The second thing that we want to say is that civil wars in these countries already exist to a significant extent. In the majority of dictatorships, there's at least one or two paramilitary groups, if not more, fighting against the country. So conflicts do exist. Very often the goal of these conflicts and the professed finishing of the conflict for the paramilitary group only exists at the point where the dictator himself is eliminated. We say this probably only quickens the process. But thirdly, this is a point of technical burdens. Opposition has to answer whether they want to stand in this debate for any kind of outside coercive interference towards dictatorships whose behavior we don't like. Because probably at least at some point they will stand for using things such as sanctions, things such as diplomatic exclusion, or even military intervention to coerce and cajole these governments into behaving differently. To the extent to which they stand for that in at least a certain amount of cases, they will also have to stand for our world because these people are simply better. First of all, they do not cause the collateral damage or the death caused by sanctions or military intervention. Secondly, they usually do not cause large-scale conflicts because we do not send boots on the ground. We do not finance rebels. They literally move in and kill, which seems to be more of like a drone strike of eliminating Osama bin Laden than anything else. But thirdly, there is no political interest tied to that. So you're not trying to impose your own government. You're not trying to create another dictatorship which will be loyal to you. You're rather assessing the situation from the perspective of what the chances are of the people retaining power. So that's the comparative they will have to defend. Now, you can just message me the time, anyone. I would be very grateful. Moving on to our case. What are the incentives? In the status quo, the way dictators work is that in keeping their power, which all of them essentially want to do, because not just are they power hungry, but also it's very scary to be deposed from power because it probably means your death. They're very confident in the army and the police as coercive mechanisms, which are far stronger than anything the people has and can keep the people in check. The Assassins Brotherhood circumvents this because the army and the police cannot catch them. And there have obviously been numerous examples of states around you where people have been assassinated and their lives have been threatened by this brotherhood, which means that the incentives now change, right? Because these people are a hidden terror. You never know when they will strike. You never know what they will interpret as oppressing the weak, which means you're more likely to err on the side of caution. The only way for you to prevent literally being killed in cold blood is to start treating your people better. Why? Because this brotherhood eludes negotiations. They're not a member of the United Nations. You can't sit at a table with them. You can't promise them anything in return. The only thing they take in return is that you fulfill their definition of not mistreating your people, which means that the impact of this debate is less oppression in terms of starving your people, in terms of taking away resources and monopolizing them, in terms of taking away the job opportunities, at least more often than not. But we also say that these assassins are also going to target not just the president of the country, they can target anyone whom they perceive to be the ruling class, which means that there are also control mechanisms within the high echelons of political and economic power that are at least going to push towards some kind of political change, if nothing out of fear for their own life. But there's a couple of other things we want to say here. We also want to say here that if we have an outside intervention, or if a rebellion succeeds in these countries without the Assassins Brotherhood and imposes their own government, probably after the period of war and after the group that espoused liberation now being the oppressors, there's no one to stand behind the people and no one to lead another deposition of the leader, or at least not for several decades. We say this is the only recourse for the people if external intervention or internal intervention fails. But lastly, we want to talk about how this changes the general perception of the government of the threat that is posed to them. Before I move on to explaining that, I'll take CEO.
Okay, does the Brotherhood ever publicly admit to doing these killings and explaining why they did that or when they plan to do this again?
They obviously, I mean, we didn't have the power to define that as a model, but they obviously do so by virtue of the info slide saying this is extremely visible, which means that connected to their creed, they obviously leave a certain message. Or if not directly by standing in a square yelling, this is why I did that, because obviously then they would be caught. But there are probably things such as propaganda pamphlets. There are probably things such as myths and legends. There's something like Robin Hood, like nobody saw Robin Hood, but everyone knows why he does that, right? Okay, so moving on to how this changes the general perception. First of all, this significantly increases the propaganda power that the opposition has, because the opposition can claim, even though that may not be true, to be in contact with the Brotherhood because they obviously protect the weak and these are the only people who they're going to communicate with. But also by knowing that they have the Brotherhood on their side, this simply increases to a significant extent the hope that the people of the country have to depose the government, which means that recruitment into opposition forces tends to be far more efficient because they know that their leader is not untouchable, that of the country is not untouchable in any sense. And this is also what the country and the government are aware of to a significant extent, right? Because when they know that their propaganda machine essentially goes against a mythical cult, which espouses like the greatest success any rebellious movement wants to espouse, and that is literally being the liberators of the country. And when they know that recruitment is high because morale amongst the people, when they know the dictator can be killed, is going to be higher, they're probably going to take steps to prevent this. And obviously this is not military repression because this increases the chance of you being killed. But we also say that there is an effect of fear, right? Because if you come in as a new person, a new dictator, something like this, if you know that your predecessor was killed for certain things, we say that you're at least less likely to commit similar things and you are likely to act in a different way. We see that like this happens to an extent even when people are not killed. So let's take the USSR and the de-Stalinization politics that they had after Joseph Stalin died. Nobody was killed, but the very fact that they were diplomatically excluded, economically excluded, meant that the entire regime had to change, at least to a significant extent, the way it treats its people in order to retain the power it had. When this becomes existential, at least comparatively to the alternatives OPPO has to stand for, if they don't want to leave these people to their own merits and their own strengths, this alternative is better. So this is a world we prefer on that metric, open government wins.
I would like to thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech and call on the Leader of Opposition to open opposition bench.
So just 1 second to get my timer ready. I'm also going to stand up because I feel better when I do that, because it feels like I'm debating. Please don't judge me. Okay. Perfect. Panel, 3 things in this speech. First of all, a mixture of framing and rebuttal, because I think it is important to set up a counterfactual in this debate and to counter some of the pieces of framing / assertions that we got from opening government as to where this debate actually takes place. Then 2 main points. First of all, the transfers of power, how this debate is probably most relevant in the places where these assassins are capable of actually killing people, what happens to those countries after those dictators fall and why it's worse. And then second of all, the behavior of leaders clashing directly, obviously what we heard from opening government, and how this changes the behavior of leaders in all repressive countries of all kinds. A couple of things though on the stuff that's happening in this debate. First of all, the counterfactual here is not that we have to stand over military intervention. We can stand over effectively just the status quo, which is that some dictatorships go on for a long time and they are stable and repressive and bad, but in many ways less bad than the immense violence and often cycles of violence that will follow the deposition of an autocratic leader. We can also support things that do happen, like maybe occasional military interventions if someone has determined that might actually be a good idea, or also like groundswell opposition, like just like anything else. We don't actually have to support a specific counterprop, but we're not going to be talked into it by the Prime Minister. A couple of important things also, though, specifically on the parameters of the group. First of all, they're not omniscient. Like their creed says that they should assassinate the leaders of autocratic countries. The idea that they will always make near perfect decisions about which autocratic leaders are the best ones to take out is first of all just not plausible. But second of all, given they are motivated to kill autocratic leaders because of some philosophical cult-like belief that autocratic leaders deserve to be killed, that means if anything, they're probably likely to do it in lots of cases where it's actively bad. But either way, I just don't think that the opening government get to mech that in. Second of all, the idea that civil wars exist under status quo in most of these countries, presumably if there's a civil war going on, the impact of killing an autocratic leader is less. They're less of an autocratic leader and one of many competing autocratic leaders. So it's actually probably a situation in which this applies less. You are probably looking at stable autocratic countries because that will be ones in which deposing a dictator would actually do something and change the situation. Third of all, you absolutely don't know that these people exist. They are absolutely not going to announce their existence. First of all, because this is canon within the Assassin's Creed world. But second of all, I would note 2 very important words in the info side. First of all, recently formed. Second of all, secretive. Yes, these assassinations are happening publicly, like they get a guy shot in public, but then the guy that just means you know that someone assassinated him. They're not going to announce, by the way, my name's Jack and I work for the Assassins Brotherhood. Who exactly committed that assassination is obviously going to be up for debate. The whole point of a secretive cult is that it's secretive. Let's talk about transfer of power, because the note that the opening government cases we heard from the Prime Minister exclusively talked about the ability of this to influence leaders before anything happens. I would note also this debate probably is most relevant partially because obviously it does more to a country if the leader gets assassinated rather than the situations in which the leader is afraid of getting assassinated. But also it's again, the info slide says that these guys have an incredibly good track record, a near perfect track record. So presumably there are going to be quite a few instances in which this does actually take place. Why is that bad? Because the transition of power is almost never going to result in a democratic regime, and the regime it results in, even if that regime is nominally democratic, will be worse. Why is this true? Because dictators don't rule alone, and I think this is something that's largely acknowledged in theory by opening government, but it's never unpacked what it actually means. They talk about how these leaders are dependent on groups like police, the army, ones they didn't mention who are probably important are sources of revenue, often large businessmen, controllers of the natural resources in the country, the surf oil goons in Russia, whatever. The note that these forces don't go away, and they are aware that their close connection to whoever is in power is the only thing that continues to provide them with important things. In the case of the army, that's money. In the case of big business tycoons, it's preferable treatment. They're probably massive tax breaks, if not actual subsidies from the government. These people are powerful enough to have been propping up an authoritarian regime 10 minutes ago. They are not going to go away, so they are obviously going to want to be proximate to whoever's in power next. What does that look like? That looks like them probably competing amongst each other for power. It looks like factions forming. It probably looks like, not in all cases, but certainly in a lot of cases, civil war. There are probably 3 broad things that can happen as a result of this. First, a close affiliate of the previous dictator who's already has secured the support of the army and all the important tycoons just steps this in, and effectively nothing has changed except for probably the level of paranoia that that leader has. And we'll talk in a moment about why that's important and dangerous. Second of all, there are multiple powerful groups who could potentially end up in power. They compete with each other. That means massive amounts of violence go on as they're obviously trying to get physical control of territory, of the capital city, of the means of production, the oil wells, the factories, whatever it is, that will kill lots of people, and that is incredibly bad. Last of all, it could be a nominally democratic regime. Why is that not likely? Because obviously it takes years and years to establish democratic norms, and the people holding the guns, like the army and the police, are obviously just more powerful, more able to get control of those things I talked about a moment ago than ordinary citizens. But also, even whether it is an autocratic regime of some sort that wins the civil war, or is a democratic or a nominally democratic regime, the result is going to be worse, because knowing that they're in an incredibly unstable position, they're a new government that just got in, the previous guy got assassinated, so obviously there's some like politicking going on within this country. They are very likely to be paranoid about their position and likely to be more repressive and violent for fear that the people will rise up against them, given the instability and given the vulnerability of a new regime. If they're a democratic regime, this means that they might be deposed by powerful forces. If they're an autocratic regime, this means they'll be massively repressive for fear that they will be deposed by a rival autocrat or by democratic forces. OG is offering me a POI, but I ideally like one from CG. If CG, no, okay.
What do you think allows for a democratic regime to rise?
I think it takes years of the institution of norms and the creation of an expectation among a people that they should demand a certain level of accountability for their leaders. I don't think simply murdering someone does that. But I also would note that specifically, I'm going to start clashing directly with some of the stuff they said about the behavior of leaders, because it is effectively asserted that these people will be perfectly aware of the existence of this Assassins Brotherhood, and that therefore they will make the determination the only way they can hold on to power is by being nice to their people. Two reasons this is true. First of all, being nice to your people and staying in power are often mutually exclusive. If you spend your tax money on making your people's lives better, you can't use that to pay off the army to continue to keep you in power or provide subsidies to those business interests who are financing part of your regime. Those two things are often mutually exclusive. The reason leaders are repressive to their people and deny them basic human rights is not just because they're evil, it's because it is part of a system that they used to keep in power. Second of all, if you provide people with food and education, that gives them more food in their bellies and more reasons to believe that they should rise up against you. Therefore, it is often, again, a direct move against your rule to be nice to your people. But also just paranoia. Like, a lot of leaders with the belief that there's a chance that they will die, won't want to die, and will obviously resort to military means, bodyguards, repression, scapegoating of minorities. Katrina's going to talk more about this stuff. We think it makes like autocratic regimes that exist worse, and where it deposes them, the result will be more autocratic stuff and just badness. Okay, very proud to oppose. Thank you.
I would like to thank the Leader of Opposition for that fine speech and call on the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Would it generally be okay if I leave my camera off? Because my Zoom has already crashed twice while I was speaking.
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, thank you. Panel, two main points in my speech. First, about incentives of authoritarian regimes and how we flip them on their head. And second, on transfers of power, which is where all my rebuttal to OO will be integrated, because there was literally the whole speech. Before that, just a bit of framing. Please notice that OO says that these countries are fragile. You should probably not shake them, because anything will probably lead to a power vacuum and a lot of people dying. So what they're essentially saying is, let them fend for themselves and accept the fact that in the status quo, probably a lot of people are already dying. It's just less visible. The problem with that is that these regimes are inherently unstable, which means that, yes, some of them do happen to go on for a long time, but the longer they go on, the worse the results. I don't think Venezuela is better off right now because we let Maduro stay in power for as long as we have, even though his regime might have looked quite stable for a while, right? the power vacuum, when you eventually remove that leader, will happen anyway. And if there is to be a civil war, that will happen anyway. We don't think that just because we push it into the future, that will go away. I think it actually makes it a lot worse, because the longer you allow an authoritarian regime to be in power, the longer its roots go, the longer everything else around it dies because it's been strangled to death. I don't think OO has a viable solution, even though it might look better in the short term before the bubble bursts. But the bubble will burst eventually, and when that does, opening government's world is wildly preferable. So just one more extraneous point on the idea that like, oh, but like it's a secretive society recently formed and they won't want anyone to know. Like, they're like pretty much every underground group wants to remain anonymous, in the sense of they don't want to be caught and they don't want to be hindered in their operations. But literally every single one of them has some sort of manifesto or some sort of way to express to people what it is they stand for. And I posit that simply the fact that it is in the info side and that we do know that that is what they stand for probably doesn't mean that we are involved in a secret organization. It probably means that they do want people to know that they target leaders who go after the poor, right? But not only that, I don't think the motion, or rather the info slide, specifically means the one dictator, right? It means leaders, and it's at plural. So it probably means that if we decide that in some sort of country, it's, you know, one dictator with two of his cronies that hold all the power, I don't see anything in the info slide or the motion again saying that you can maybe kill 2 or 3 of the 3, right? So I don't think it's necessarily has to be that you kill one person but leave the whole regime intact. Let's look at incentives of authoritarian regimes, because OO touches a bit on that and says that, you know, they're probably not suppressing people and starving them to death because they're evil. And I agree. I think the only incentives of regimes in general, whether authoritarian or not, are self-preservation, to stay in power and for them to not, you know, be viciously killed or exiled or thrown in jail or tried in Den Haag or whatever, right? That probably means that there are only 2 reasons why they would oppress certain groups. One is because they fear that they're a threat, which sometimes happens with minorities. And second, which I think is the largest group, it's rather by negligence, because that group is not important. The fact that they get impoverished is a direct consequence of the fact that they are trying to enrich their cronies and their oligarchs to keep them happy as much as possible, because they think that their cronies are the ones that are going to keep them in power. Please notice that this is a network that cannot be caught, right? You don't know who they are, meaning you can't watch out for them, and you can't catch them, and you can't stop them, right? So maybe the first 2, 3 leaders that die because of this won't have been able to see it coming and adapt, but I think a large number of the ones that remain can adapt. Just like the first country the US intervened in with their economic hitmans didn't see it coming, but the next few of them were a bit more mindful because they already kind of knew what's coming onto them, right? So that probably means that to some extent, the existence of this organization, and we have to look at its whole existence rather than just the first cases, because we look at what world do we prefer, and I think that the world in which they exist already is a world in which the incentives of these leaders have been flipped on their head, because now you know the security of your regime doesn't depend on the richest and how pleased they are with you, but actually depends on how low the poorest are, and are they absolutely miserable and starving, right? And OO says, well, if you give them food and education, they will rise against you, and that's exactly what we are saying, right? If you want to not keep them entirely miserable so that you get killed, you will probably have to make sure that they are at least not starving to death, and they will probably have, if not themselves, and their children will have some sort of access to education. What does that look like in terms of transfers of power? Because opening opposition says transfers of power almost never lead to democracy. And panel, I think they are factually correct, but I think the reason why most transfers of power rarely lead to democracy is because they aren't carefully planned, because no one actually keeps in mind what kind of what is a good time for this to happen, and never keeps in mind what is viable and what is even the person that needs to be killed. They rarely even succeed in killing their leader. More often than not, these the countries that end up in chaos are a result of impromptu uprisings that are a direct result of people who just can't take it anymore, right? They aren't people who are who are living, who are able to start slowly eroding the monopoly on either resources or information that comes from the government, but they're just people who are desperate and just snap at some point, and one tiny thing leads to a massive riot where tons of people
Last
die.
chance.
Yes, I will take you.
Okay, do you think the Brotherhood would kill Xi Jinping?
I don't know. I don't know if they would kill Xi Jinping. That's for them to decide. So the thing is that even if opposition can say that, oh yeah, but at least the regime is stable because there is no uprising, what they have to defend is the fact that even if the cycles of violence are invisible because they're not on the streets and in the media, doesn't mean that they don't exist. Doesn't mean that there isn't a steady stream of people that are being jailed, tortured, and killed. Doesn't mean that there aren't people dying of hunger. It doesn't mean that they aren't living in constant terror and panic, right? Which probably means that eventually there will be uprisings, there will be more unsuccessful and lead to more people killed because they weren't carefully planned, carefully executed, or even successful in removing the people they wanted to remove, right? So opposition says it takes years to establish democracy, but they don't explain, but it's not the time that matters, right? It's what happens in the time that matters. And we think that if the weakest class is even a bit better off on our side of the house, that leaves them in a better position to be able to free themselves from however oppressive that regime is. I strongly prefer a world in which these assassins exist and do their job. Very proud to propose.
I would like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech and call on the Deputy Leader of Opposition. I'll also quickly turn on my light because it's getting very dark, so give me half a sec. Okay. Also, just as a quick note, no unmuting POI interjections, please.
After 3 years in the IDF and choosing where and who the IDF takes choices in obliterating, I think there's quite a lot to be said on this issue. Two arguments in today's debate. First is why we believe that the case in which the individuals are going to be assassinated are the ones which inspire stability in the long term, and the second is going to be about changes in dictatorships and why they're better. All of the rebuttal is going to be integrated, I hope, and whatever I miss, Anya is going to do for me. Let's delve right in, right? Because when we talk about, because OG throws out a few lines as to why we believe that the Brotherhood is going to make the right choices, but they don't actually analyze it to any real extent, and they get fairly attacked on this by inside OO. And that's why we're going to do quite a lot of analysis. First, let's understand, we believe that you need to have the hypothetical means to recognize which regimes are likely to be democratic and which ones are likely to be unstable and to just either be switched by another autocratic regime or just fall into a station of war and conflict. So first we say, and we give this in the POI to OO when we ask them, look, which are the countries which in the long term become democracies? And they give us criteria. They tell us ones in which there are the correct institutions which are currently propped up, in which there are long-term expectations from the population which are strong enough to overcome, say, the norms of army coup d'etat, etc. And they also tell us about that there needs to be a viable alternative in place. And we agree with all of this. We believe that. All of these things are very much identifiable, right? We can know, and we're going to talk with the right resources, we can know all of these things. We can know what the public sentiment is regarding the dictatorship and how much they're likely to fight against it. We can know this by putting people on the streets. We can know this by doing the patient polls. We can know this by, if we had enough resources, we could definitely do this. We can know if there are viable alternatives. We can know how strong the opposition is, how many troops it has on the ground, and whether or not it can easily and efficiently take over the capital. We can know how loyal the government and the police are and the army are to the local dictatorship. We can know how much they want to change. We can know what are the different relationships between them and whether in the long term that is something which is going to last or what a lot of them want to change. And how are we going to know this, and why is the Brotherhood going to act only in cases, why does it have enough resources to know this. First of all, we need to accept that it's not a magical foundation, meaning for it to be able to carry out very, very complicated assassinations easily and to never get caught, it needs to have massive amounts of resources. It needs to have quite a lot of contacts in the area. It needs to be able to cross borders easily. It needs to be able to get into the inner circle of the relevant politician so that they can easily kill him without anyone knowing, right? And we believe that anyone who has all of these things, who has the money and the resources available to it, who has the ability to connect to inner circles, who has the ability to know exactly which route to take so that they won't be caught on the way out, is the one who can reflect quite well on what exactly the situation of the state is. And why is this important? Because it means that it can recognize a priori whether or not the circumstances which allow for a democratic regime to exist in the circumstance, in the situation where they're going to assassinate. Furthermore, we say that just look, they're likely to have quite a strong alliance with Western democracies. And why is this? A, we believe that they have aligned philosophies, right, which is something which is often quite useful for alliances. They terribly hate dictatorships. And B, and this is more important, we believe they have massive incentives to cooperate. And why? On the Western side, we believe that it is often good for them to be ready, right, to know when and where the assassin is going to strike, and that is something which is going to be good enough for them to, say, offer quite a lot of resources in return to this knowledge. And B, we say they're often going to want the influence, right? They're going to want to be able to influence who the assassin, the Brotherhood tries to target, etc., because this is something which very much further the geopolitical policies, etc. On the Brotherhood side, we believe they also have two things. First, we just believe that in terms of the resources which they can gain from these Western powers, this is massive. If the bottom line is the fact that they want to get rid of authoritarian regimes, something which we assume and all groups assume in this debate, we believe that they know that the way to do that is to make sure that they have the massive resources of the West at their disposal, that they can go from border to border, that they have their planes, that they have the intelligence, etc. All this means that if this alliance exists, then there is not only the resources of the Brotherhood, which are likely to be massive, but also the resources of the entire West at their disposal in order to make sure that they can target exactly the right regimes and recognize which ones are likely to fall into another dictatorships or become unstable in the long term. Why do you believe that they have a massive incentive to look for specifically the ones that are likely to be stable? And here what we get from Orwell is they says, oh, they're fanatics, they're fanatic philosophical, and they're going to kill anyone regardless of whether or not it's going to be stable in the long term. Here we just answer you, look, no, we believe that, like most people who believe that autocratic regimes are terrible, the incentive is going to be to make sure that there aren't autocratic regimes tomorrow. The way that they do that is by ensuring that there isn't a new one cropped up, or that there isn't a significant enough power vacuum to allow this to happen. Second of all, we believe that because there's likely to be a very strong alliance between them and the West, and we believe that the West have a massive incentive not to allow for power vacuums and not to allow for instability and not to allow for a situation which just a new autocratic regime can arise, then they in the first place have probably the ability to precondition quite a lot of the resources which they're going to give to the Brotherhood in order to influence whether or not and whom they murder. I believe that the Brotherhood is likely to accept this because there is a limited amount of people who they can eradicate, and they're going to want the ability, and they don't want to have the to lose all of the resources just because they wanted to kill a person rather. What does all this mean? Before I get to the impact of this, all this means that in the wide majority of cases in which these assassinations are going to take place, it's going to be against the one who is vehemently violent, and it is going to be in places where stability in the long term is very, very, very likely. Let's move in. Before I continue,
even if you're capable of making the Brotherhood as perfectly capable of determining every outcome, and you've telling these perfect dictatorships that will take one assassination to fall into democracy even exist, how does the assassination not itself damage the norms of democracy which are necessary for long-term stability?
Right, so let's talk about that right now, right? Because A, we're not meching, we've just given you 4 minutes of analysis. Meching was what OG did, that is where our major extension is. But let's see how this affects and why this is better than an alternative. Because slowly, when we can get rid of the specific power holders who can currently control the loyalties of a variety of different army members, but we also know that if they stop existing, then this loyalty would stop, that the public opinion would change, and that the institutions in place are strong enough now to switch them, then we'll be able to, in the long term, create democratic regimes in these areas. Why is this the most important impact by massive margins? Because look, wars in these areas are going to be anyway. Instability is going to be anyway. Small margins on whether or not they're going to be slightly nicer or slightly less nice to the population is probably going to be quite small. What makes a difference is whether in the long term we can make sure that there isn't a dictatorship. We can make sure that the person in charge isn't one who vanquishes his population. We can make sure that he doesn't murder his people on the thousands. We can make sure that he gives them the relevant infrastructure and the relevant things that they need. Because this is the most important impact in the debate, and we're the only one who actually show why it's likely, I beg you to propose.
I would like to thank the member of government for that fine speech and call on the member of opposition here.
From CO, we're going to extend on power vacuums, because even though O already ran it, we think they left out most of the important mechanisms and analysis. The second thing we're going to provide is an alternative that we think is more beneficial in the long term, and lastly, a weighing between the two things, between the two worlds, because opening opposition didn't do that as well. Before that, a couple of answers to CG specifically, but also parts of OG. So what they're saying is, both of them, the creed always does the right thing. They're kind of this omnipotent calculator that just realizes what the optimal thing is. We think this is unlikely because of 4 reasons. Number one, they're a creed, therefore they probably have a philosophical stance. This was already said by opening opposition, but it wasn't answered by the government teams. Second, what if those, after calculating, found out that most authoritarian regimes are actually the better version of the world? Their creed would be kind of useless, therefore defeating the purpose of the creed, and it would just be somewhat of an unreasonable organization. Their purpose very explicitly is stated as killing authoritarians. A third reason, it's kind of a meta reason, but if this debate really was, do we want a group that always does the right thing, this would be kind of gov heavy. Given that the CAs have posed this motion, we think it's kind of unreasonable that this is what the CAs wanted us to say. Last reason, if they actually calculated in advance, it would be obvious for these authoritarian regimes, after some killings had happened, to change their strategy themselves. For example, most people could just say, we will put a grim trigger on our own population. So if you kill us, we will make sure that there's tons, like hundreds or thousands of ways in which we will bomb the shit out of our own population. We will just blow a nuke, whatever. As soon as this grim trigger is in place, it makes sense for the Grim Brotherhood just to leave them all alone. Therefore, it defeats the just magic government case. Okay, number one, a little bit of characterization that we think is reasonable in this debate. We think that even though they might leave a flag or the mafia or something similar to that, like Tin said, we think that in the first couple of killings, people will not expect this magic brotherhood to exist, or they will think that the other government was incompetent later. That means if, for example, you were to kill, if this brotherhood were to kill a couple of people, let's say 10 authoritarian regimes, that wouldn't mean that there would be a strong change in incentives in the direction that opening government wants for these authoritarian regimes. Rather, they would try to crack down even harder on terrorist groups or on whatever they think this creed is. And they're not likely to just give up their rights, because I think it's more plausible for an authoritarian to try to preserve themselves and their power rather than change their behavior in any way. And it's likely that they would think it's due to the incompetence of the other country or due to other reasons that they have not been able to figure out how exactly this works. Because in the real world, it's very unlikely that there would be such a creed that is really undetectable. Since we're in the real world, it's unlikely that people would calculate under unreal world conditions. Okay, now let's go to our extensions on power vacuums. Opening opposition already said that there might be wars around the succession, etc. What we are going to focus here is, number one, why specifically in authoritarian regimes power vacuums are very likely to arise, or what the different scenarios are. Just a little bit more of analysis on here. Number one, in authoritarian regimes, the power is centralized around one person specifically. That means they control the state media and the narrative. They control most parts of the economy. They have their cronies, etc. They also control politics. That means they pick and choose their friends and foes. They pick and choose the opposition bench, etc., etc. Just think about Putin, what he's doing in Russia currently. So as soon as they are dead, there is a gigantic power vacuum because they explicitly want to make sure that nobody is close to defeating them. Therefore, there are no mechanisms of succession in place because very specifically, you don't want a successor. This is a gigantic problem. The second option is that all the cronies, for some reason, don't fight with each other and just install a puppet leader. Then you might have a democracy that doesn't really exist because it's still controlled by the cronies of the other part. However, we think it's significantly more likely that the cronies will actually fight for succession, and they probably have different fractions opposing each other. That might be fractions from different companies or from different regions of the country or from different ethnicities, but all of them want to be the successor. That means they will try to or they don't even necessarily have the intention to do this, but they will try to remove other successors, and therefore there will be civil wars, etc., etc. There will be tons of atrocities within these particular countries. That has two effects, and this is something that opening opposition didn't focus on at all. Number one, if there's a continued civil war, international companies pull out of your country because it's bad for business if people are killing each other and you can't sell or produce stuff. Therefore, the economy is going to tank of these countries massively. Opening government, please.
Per CEO's own mechanism, their best case scenario is literally that you get the power vacuum and factional struggles of power when different strands of the army and party start fighting against each other when the dictator dies. So apart from not having an extension, what CEO is essentially saying is not doing anything and simply postponing the harms. Op is uncomparative.
No. I'm going to come to an alternative very soon. Yeah, the rest I already said. Okay, the other thing is that the other possibility is that there is some stability within that country. So maybe you will find a successor or something. However, this most of the time means that this country is extremely weak because after recently formed government, that means you have to get all the keys to power again and again, and you need to find your allies within the government. We therefore think this is a prime time for Western companies or other powers to grab power within your country, to grab all the resources, to do bad trade deals with you, all of that. Also, bad for your long-term economy, still tanks you. So what we are saying is, if you kill Xi Jinping, there's probably 100 different ethnicities in China fighting for power. This is really bad because China is currently quite stable. We think this is bad. The alternative we want to provide is mostly the status quo. We just think slow economic integration over time. Sometimes you support the opposition, like in Venezuela. Sometimes, if people do really bad stuff, like Putin in the Crimea, we sanction the country. But otherwise, we basically say it's a sovereign country and we get the fuck out. Soft power and all of this stuff is what we support. On the weighing, we think we prefer a stable regime versus a fucked up regime because people prefer to live and have some economic well-being over their own freedom. Therefore, please oppose.
I would like to thank the member of opposition for that fine speech and call on the government whip to summarize this debate beside Gov.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay. I'm going to have two questions in my speech. The first one is going to talk about how will they choose the acts, how the Brotherhood would choose the acts, and how likely they are to be successful in choosing the right cases and the cases that they are more likely to actually to happen in a successful way. Second class is going to talk about the day after and what do we see. But before that, I think one main point of rebuttal. I'm totally not sure where is the extension coming from CO. I think that even the bottom lines given to us by the speaker in the last minute says, look, if you kill Xi Jinping, there will be other people to replace them. We prefer the status quo, whether there's more stability over making people die. I think it's exactly like we just heard from opening opposition. So I'm just going to talk about it directly in my cases. But before that, one crucial point of rebuttal, because opposition seems to think that if we prefer a world with the brotherhood exist in it, we want a world with a magic solution to all of the problems. We want to solve hunger, we want to solve all of the debts, we want to solve all of the dictatorship. No, that is not the burden on government side in this debate. All we need to prove is that our side is better. And you know what? even if there's going to be only one case of that the Brotherhood would choose to go upon and to chase, and that case will be successful, is enough for us to say that at least on our world, one country is the better off comparing to their side. We do not need to prove to you that they're going to change the entire world. We just need to prove to you that when they would choose to do something, it will be successful and will be under our side of the house. And one point of extraneous rebuttal, again, before I jump into my points, notice that it's truly hard to find the delta on opposition side, right? Because all of the things they described to you about the fact that dictators' leaderships as an incentive now to severe and stricten with the citizens and fight opponents, truly, to me, it sounds like the status quo. Already now, they want to make sure that nobody will ever kill them, nobody will ever coup on them, they have no incentive to have them. Opening government already mentions that, but what opening government doesn't mention is the fact that once opposition doesn't actually explain to you the delta the day after, why tomorrow those citizens are going to suffer so much more and why those citizens are going to have so much less food, then I'm truly not sure what the delta is. Let's jump into my first point about when will they choose to act and how will they do it, okay? Because OG explains to you that we're already talking about places where there are conflicts, everything is super dangerous, and everything is under a bucket. OO says that the alternative is better, is worse, and we just prefer that everything will stay stay as the status quo. So, as I already mentioned, I'm truly not sure why the status quo is better, because for those citizens already the conditions are the worst as possible, right? Because that is the incentive for those leaderships that we're trying to kill, right, under the Brotherhood. Already the incentive is to make their life as hard as possible. So even if the Brotherhood will exist, I'm totally not sure why will it be worse. Secondly, I'm totally not sure why even if 5% of them are going to die, it's not going to be better off for the rest of the population. I'm sorry, this is not a political correct thing to say that we want somebody to die, but truly, if 200 people are going to die, but 2 million are going to live better, and they're going to have better lives overall, and more food, and won't starve as much, I think that is a way that's fairly to say that we're fine with that. Never engage with that part of government side. But furthermore, their entire case rests upon the fact that the Brotherhood would not be successful in choosing the cases where they're going to attack. OG says, look, but it says so in the info side, and we think it's something that's fair to say. We say, okay, you know what? Even if the info side gave you that, we're going to analyze to you why that is likely. My partner already gave to you 5 answers to that, right? Let's hear what COO had to say about it, right? They said, look, they had a philosophy, that philosophy could be bad. We think it's not likely, because we do have the fear to say that at least the guidelines of their philosophy is something good. But also, we think that those people take pride of their actions, right? They could be assassins by their own. They didn't have to join the Brotherhood specifically, meaning they want to compare themselves to other people and use their resource as well. That's why they want to use specifically a group of people and not do those assassins alone. We think all of those things prove to you that they want to be the best from that specific group, right? Meaning they won't go and chase after things that they think it's not likely to work, because then the entire group will look at them and say, well, you're probably not that good, right? As in every debate society, we think in groups it happens. So we think that most of them are going to choose wisely. When they tell you, look, they may find out that if they don't intervene, it's better, or they will find out that the other states will change their ways. It's completely okay with us. Even if they choose at the end of the day not to intervene in any of them, at least on our side, we have the benefit of them maybe intervening, and we think it's good enough. Why is it so crucial? Because notice that once opening government doesn't explain to you exactly how they're going to be so successful, everything that opening opposition blames them upon is true. Before I continue,
Okay, so both your OG and us agree that dictatorships rely on many supporting actors to stay in power. How did this perfect dictatorship you're talking about, where one assassination will change all the structures, even exist anywhere in the world?
No. So I say that those dictatorships already have everything that they need, right? They have the police, they have their army, they're doing everything in their powers in order to stay in power. So your delta under this side of the house is not that big if you're already mentioning that they're doing everything that they can in order to make sure that nobody will kill him, even if the Brotherhood doesn't exist at all. You have no delta specifically there, doesn't regard anything OG. So once we explain to you exactly why everything that OO says is rest upon the fact that they won't be successful, and we prove to you that they're going to choose exactly the cases that are successful, it is completely with all the problems that we get from OO. That means that we're going to get all the successful parts. Regarding the day after, although we just proved to you why we think the day after will probably be good because of the fact that they're going to choose those things, notice that under our side, we don't have to know that the Brotherhood was the one to do that. OG rests upon the fact that the Brotherhood exists will scare other people, will scare other leadership. We don't, even if there's not going to be anything after that one time, it's still better off on our side than on opposition side. From all of those reasons, please propose.
I would like to thank the government whip for that fine speech and call on the opposition whip to summarize this debate side up.
Right, 1 second, please. Just need to sort my paper. Okay. I think there's three main clashes in the debate, and before that, some questions on how this motion is to be interpreted in the first phase, which are A, how do dictators writ large react to the emergence and existence of this brotherhood, and what kind of incentives does this set? Secondly, in the case of dictators being assassinated, what are the consequences to which this leads, and can democracies emerge? And then sort of secondly, do civil wars happen anyway under both sides? Okay, first, let's ask some questions on how we can reasonably interpret this motion. We don't think government has the fiat to say, just because the info slide says that the Brotherhood is really good at this one thing, therefore by necessity, they must be incredible at all these other things. We think that's like a really weird and unfair twisting of the motion into like strange debate magic. We think the point here is government has the like magic to kill leaders, but they can't simply defend that democracies always arise out of this. That seems fair. Okay. So we think this is the first problem with the closing government. We don't buy their core logic. We think that's like really not the point. But the second thing is also, like as OO pointed out in the POI, like the kind of perfect conditions for democracy to emerge, they don't exist anywhere. And Marius already told you that in the extension when he talked to you about how the logic of a dictatorship in itself requires diversified power structures, because you cannot have a clearly defined succession pathway as a dictator, because that means you are at risk of being deposed yourself from that very successor. So you need to have as many people with roughly similar power and very little capacity to coordinate and organize among themselves to keep yourself safe. So even if CG was correct, this there would just never be any assassinations and nothing happened. We think they're out of the debate. Let's talk about opening government. What opening government tells you is that dictators will respond to the incentive of possibly being killed by treating their populations better. And like opening opposition tells you like, nuh-uh, that doesn't happen. They're instead going to crack down. But we don't think opening opposition really gives a reason. They say fear. But the important point that Marius tells you is at least at the very beginning of the emergence of this brotherhood, no one knows that it exists, and no one has reason to believe that they are perfect magic assassins who simply like snuff leaders out of existence. I'll take you like in a while. So as a result, and we think this is a highly implausible thing to believe in general. Like it takes a lot of evidence for you to be convinced for that to be right. So there's at least going to be 4 to 5 to 6 assassinations before leaders actually think that they're invincible and like perfect assassins. Before then, what happens? Then the harms that OO wants to claim can actually accrue. Then the leaders become more paranoid, then they crack down, then they think that either the West is the likely reasons of these assassinations and there's more international tensions, breakdown of trade barriers, like possible wars, or they're simply going to look for culprits in their own country and simply crack down on their own populations even harder, but you do not get these impacts without the mechanism that we brought you. We think then there's a transitionary period in which dictators actually believe that this is the case. We think in that period, they may want to treat their population better, but it's unclear that this is magically possible. Like, the point of a dictatorship is that they are propped up by oligarchs, by the army, and by different specific power institutions. They need to satisfy the demands of these institutions by looting the country and by giving the spoils to these specific oligarchs. So if you stop doing that, they stop supporting you and instead support someone else, since they're not at risk of being assassinated, so they can actually do that. So you can't simply do that. Lastly, it's also very unclear that dictators are actually rationally, deciding this rationally, as even OG characterized them as being power hungry and narcissistic, so we're not sure they respond to these incentives anyway. Lastly, we think what OG completely forgot is that dictators obviously have a way of reacting to this by ensuring that the Brotherhood will not be likely to kill them by employing grim trigger strategies, aka saying, like, I have placed a nuke under Pyongyang. If you kill me, this will necessarily detonate, and as a result, you won't want to do this. The consequence of this is, after a certain point, dictators have adapted to this, and the Brotherhood will either have to cease assassinating them or risk possible insane collateral damage. Both of these are bad, so we don't think in the long term these assassinations happen anywhere. I'll take OG now.
Right. The first few assassinations may not make this world a better place, but the overall existence of this thing does. Because of the fact that the problem with armies and people you buy is that they are poor themselves and they turn against you as soon as it looks like you might die or be defeated.
Well, this is just a bit unclear to me. Wait, did we just lose Kat? Okay, so I'm just going to go on in my speech. It was at 5 minutes and 20. So the second big question in the debate is, can democracies reasonably emerge out of the fact that a leader has been assassinated? OO gave you some reason for why civil war happened, but the crucial thing that Marius delivered afterwards is to show why there's a diversified power structure in dictatorships necessarily. OO asserted this and therefore concluded the civil war is likely. We showed you the principled reason why dictatorship need to be designed in such a way that power is diversified. Therefore, you have different factions that cannot coordinate very well with each other because they've been groomed not to in the past, and neither of them has enough power to seize power. So as a result, you will have civil wars. But we also gave you another extension in explaining that even if you get a democracy, this democracy is likely to be very weak and will be exploited by a number of different Western economic actors that, like when the Soviet Union fell in Russia, will exploit the natural resources of the country and ultimately leave it worse off. Well, how does that leave us in terms of weight? We think ultimately under our side, the average citizen of an autocratic state has better life and economic outcomes on average, and as a result has a slightly better life. Like, right on government, you have some off chance that democracies may emerge. We showed why that is very unlikely. Lastly, government can tell us that, oh, look, civil wars will happen anyway since leaders die. Like, yes, that is the case, but you preemptively kill leaders. So you have at least, you have civil wars at at least double the rate than we have under our side. So you get this kind of instability more often. Look, this plunges many countries into civil war, into poverty, and into cycles of violence, abuse, and crime. We don't think that is a good idea. Please oppose.